Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good following morning, and very importantly today, good late night for today's guest. We have a guest joining us. I always make reference to our Australian viewers. Not that there are that many, but there is at least one, and we're having him today on the show. My guest today is going to be Ezra May. Ezra is a good guy. I see him once a year. He usually comes at least to Krakow, and he is the president of the Australian Society of Polish Jews and their descendants. So we're going to talk to Ezra and see what's going on in Australia and with those wacky Australian Polish Jews. I do not see comments, so if there are, oh, there we go. Jeffrey Rolat, it's way too early. It's like 3 a.m. for you, Mr. Rolat. Look at that. That's determination, perseverance. Going back to sleep? No, we will keep you awake, Jeffrey. Don't go back to sleep. Good morning, Lori. Yeah, I know the time. So, of course, that's why the time is different. Today we had to do it earlier because Ezra was kind enough and considerate enough to stay up till midnight, past midnight, to come on the show. So it would have been just really insane for him to stay up till the normal time, 4 p.m. here. So it's midnight now in Melbourne, where Ezra will be joining us from. I know you guys had a lot of snow in New York. So does anyone want to come and shovel snow in New York? I wouldn't mind shoveling some snow in New York. I would not mind. I don't like the cold, but it's cold here, and I wouldn't mind being in New York. So I would shovel your snow, Saul Schachter. I feel like I owe you that. What's going on here in Krakow? Corona, interesting. There's a press conference that got moved. They always seem to get moved, and they're always on Thursdays, which is interesting, right around the time of the show. But there's going to be a press conference soon. But an interesting statistic I saw was that in November, there were 30,000 more deaths than projected in Poland, and 11,200 confirmed deaths from Corona, which tells us what? It tells us that there are 20,000 people that either died of Corona or died because they weren't able to receive treatment that they should have received, I guess, for Corona. Yeah, something like that. So they're talking about making it even more things even more restrictive here. So restaurants are generally closed. There's only takeaway. And the hotels, it's interesting, hotels can only be open for business purposes. And people are, of course, taking advantage of it because it's not that difficult to just say, oh, I'm here for business, and then just checking into the hotel. So they're going to actually make people, I think, show some legitimate business purposes. So, okay. What else? I read a great book. I can't remember. They told me I didn't talk about it last week. I have no short-term memory. Think about Memento is my my general way of life. But I read a book which my good friend Vicky Warner, and not only president of our board and good friend, friends of board and good friend, but former guest on the AMA, gave me this book called Breath, and I read it, and I got it. Phenomenal book, talking all about breathing and the way that our health and lives are affected by the way that we breathe, and in ways that are absolutely shocking. And it's a wonderful book. I was so excited about it that I got Kasha's listening to the audiobook. I sent it to my sister. I sent it to my friend Deva in Washington. It's just a wonderful book. So I really suggest anybody get a hold of it. Breath by someone will write it in the comments. I forget who wrote it. Someone named Spectre or something like that. But anyway, an excellent book, fast read, and something really illuminating. In one of those worlds, I think that there are a few books that really, you read them and talking about nonfiction, and that you see the world differently through them, and you're like, oh my God, one of those like light bulb books. For me, I think the first one like that I remember, or one of the more powerful ones, was Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which is a wonderful book that sort of explains why the world is the way it is in terms of which countries and civilizations sort of developed in which way, in which way, and really interesting, based on where crops could grow and people had access to protein and things. Very, very interesting. James Nestor, thank you, Sebastian. Breath by James Nestor, highly recommended. Also, as is Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you haven't read Guns, Germs, and Steel, seminal work, something really must read. So Hanukkah almost over. Tonight we will light the 8th and final candle of Hanukkah. It's been a bit of a different Hanukkah than other years. I think that the timing of Hanukkah was great this year. After the timing, it's always sort of, Hanukkah is more or less when it is, but I mean that in terms of what else is going on in the world, the vaccine coming out, which some people are against, not trusting the vaccine. I understand if you want to sort of wait a little bit and see what people's reactions are, but I would definitely take the vaccine tomorrow if it were available, and would suggest that people take the vaccine when it does become available. But one is the vaccine, so you sort of feel that this idea of Hanukkah and light and moving forward and the light shining, lighting a path toward a better future, which is part of the way that I see Hanukkah, felt good this year, or felt appropriate this year, I should say, with Hanukkah, and also, of course, after the election, where we feel that we can all begin to start breathing again. This morning, actually, Kasha and I got up very early, and we did a live TV feed, which was kind of interesting. Haven't done so many things like that lately. Been a bit quieter with the world being more or less shut down, but we did a live 2.5 minutes about Hanukkah for the TV station here in Krakow, which was interesting. Once they heard me speak and then they heard Kasha speak, they asked Kasha all the questions. So it's about 15 seconds of me and 2 minutes and 15 seconds of Kasha, which, to be honest, I think is the exact perfect ratio, just enough for me so that they had to get credit for having spoken to me, and then got actual real information from Kasha. So that was that went well, actually, and that was fun. And I'll post it somewhere later. Of course, it'll be in Polish. I posted a photo on Facebook, but it should be on. They'll rebroadcast it later on this evening. We can show it. What am I doing Christmas and New Year's is a question. We are actually going to Warsaw. Kasha's sister moved to Warsaw, so we are going to go and spend the few days of the break, a couple days there in Warsaw. Very traditional. It's interesting. Christmas in Poland is, for us, I guess, American Jews, it really depends where you are, but Christmas is of course, a Christian holiday. But in Poland, it's almost to some degree that Christmas feels to me a little bit like Thanksgiving. It feels like it's not necessarily, there is, of course, a religious element to it, but it seems more like a tradition and kind of what everyone does. It doesn't feel, I guess it depends, of course, how you celebrate it. And if you're going to church and doing all of those things, more religious things. Yeah. But if you're just sort of getting together in families, it seems a little more like Thanksgiving. Jerzy, Warsaw. Yes. Marta has moved to Warsaw, and Sylvia, Kasha and Marta's mom. So poor Kasha is stuck in Krakow only with me. So please send her your warmest wishes and good luck that she's stuck with me. But no, they have room for us, and we'll come back and forth to visit. So don't worry about them being in Warsaw, and don't worry, it's not us going to Warsaw. It's just Kasha's sister and mom and her nieces in Warsaw. And let's say there are a few questions for me. One, Hanukkah, how many pączki? How many donuts did I eat for Hanukkah? This is a good question, I'm sure, submitted by Agnieszka Gish, our resident donut obsessive, director of the Ride for the Living. I think I ate 1 or 2. I'm not a big donut guy. I did have some latkes. Usually try to stay, not really doing the fried food and latkes too much, but we did have, you can't resist the freshly fried latkes. And I did have something that they have here is very good. There's a place here. I think it's called Stara Paczkarnia, something like that. Is that the name? Stara Paczkarnia, where they do fresh donuts all the time. And you can go and get like hot, fresh donuts. So Kasha and I partook not to divorce ourselves from the Hanukkah spirit. Oh, Gish with the yes, Agnieszka Gish, donut girl, donut woman. So I think my answer is officially, I think I ate 2 donuts. Another question, will Kasha publish a cookbook? We are working on that, actually. An interesting question. Will Kasha, we've been talking about that a long time. The project sort of began and then it got a little sidetracked because of Corona. But yeah, there's an idea that we do sort of Kasha's community cookbook. We do recipes based on her cooking here at the JCC, and sort of her somewhat, let's say, healthier new take on traditional European Ashkenazi Jewish cooking, which we do a lot of here, or she does a lot of. But sort of just, I think it would be a nice way for people to be able to, so many people around the world have joined us for Shabbat dinners and joined us for a meal here. So I think a JCC Kasha cookbook would allow people to, in some way, stay connected to the community, although they're not here. So it's a project. If any of you are experts in cookbook publishing, you can let me know. Gish should open her own donut shop, says Saul Schachter. Gish would probably eat them all before she would sell any. So there's 2 schools of thoughts. You say, oh, if you love donuts and you work in a donut shop, you just spend all your time eating them. Or you say, oh, you get sick of them after a while. Well, I'm not sure about Gish, but I will say that back in the day, I worked in a pizza place and I made myself pizza every single day. I never got sick of it. I always fiddled with it. I adjusted this, adjusted that, put the dough in the oven, let it rise, then put everything on top of it, and messed around with it all the time. So I think that you don't necessarily, depends how obsessive compulsive you are as a person, whether you get sick of things. But for me personally, working in a pizza place, I never got sick of it. Of course, when you're 18, 19, 20, you see the world a little bit differently than you do. These days I might try to resist, but I probably wouldn't do such an excellent job at that. And one final question before we get to Ezra, which is related to Ezra, which is, have I ever been to Australia? The answer is yes, I have been to Australia. I was brought over by good friends of mine and good friends of the JCC in our community, Sam and Gina Rosenberg from Melbourne. I went over there and did a bunch of speaking in different synagogues and media stuff and interviews, and met with a lot of people there. It was a wonderful, wonderful trip. I, as just about everybody does, not really much of a surprise, fell in love with Australia. I loved Melbourne and the community there, and I loved Sydney and the nature and the people, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place. Australia has figured it out. They're not doing something right. They have an amazing country with just great weather and the food, and it's just I think the idea of people being in this open place and on an island and so distant from everyone really makes them appreciate certain things, and you feel this kind of very laid back vibe there in Australia. But I only spent, I don't know, maybe 10 days or so there, maybe 2 weeks, which was way too short because it takes you a couple days to deal with the jet lag on either side. So it was a rough flight, but and I would probably break it up this time, do it a little differently, or at least try to use miles or something and fly business. But Australia is great, and I'm very excited to be able to welcome my guest. My guest is Ezra May, who is born and bred in Melbourne. Paternal grandparents, very, very important. Paternal grandparents from Krakow, and he's traced his family back in Krakow back until at least the 1730s. So we're told, we love people with Polish Jewish roots, but especially Krakow roots. He gets extra credit for that one. He's also the president of the Australian Society, as I said earlier, of Polish Jews and their descendants. And they're trying to promote the historical cultural heritage of Jewish life in Poland and to foster understanding between current and future generations of the Polish and Jewish communities. And they're very active organizing different events, now online, but in person, and really a strong community. And we're going to hear a little bit about what they do. So Ezra, my friend, how are you? Chag Sameach.
Jonathan, absolutely, Jonathan. We're a bit ahead of you. We've already lit our 8th candle a few hours ago. It's actually Friday morning here, 12:15. So I think it was a Gary Larson cartoon that once, I think it was him that said, "Don't worry about the world ending today, because it's already tomorrow in Australia."
Absolutely. I loved
there you go.
I love Gary Larson, The Far Side and stuff. It's fantastic. Yeah. So it's, as I said earlier, it's midnight. It's really kind of you to stay up for the next day. You know, I know you occasionally watch the show, and I do always say good morning, afternoon, evening, and good following morning. And that following morning is for you.
Appreciate that. Yes, I do.
So Ezra, so it's midnight. We are in the middle of, or the winter is beginning in a few days. Today's the 17th. The official beginning of winter is the 21st. So my understanding and memory and high school science would tell me that in 4 days our winter begins, which means in 4 days your summer begins.
Well, actually, our summer officially starts the 1st of December. So we're way ahead of you. We're 17 days ahead of you in that regard. 18 days now.
And what's the weather like?
So at the moment, it's probably about 16, 17 degrees, but it is midnight. And that's Celsius.
So that's probably about 63.
60, yeah, about that.
Or low 60s, probably in the 70s today. Bastard.
Yeah, it's a bit warmer. Yeah.
Bit warmer.
Exactly.
Bastard. Sorry, just kidding. You know, I'm somebody who's living for 19 years in a very cold place and doesn't like the cold, which is why I try to escape and get myself invited to places like Miami and Melbourne and warmer places. So this is
the right time of year. Yeah.
Exactly, it's tough. So tell me, you know, I mentioned before as I was introducing your family for the Krakow, one side from Krakow, at least to 1730. Talk a little bit about your family history, where one is Krakow, but maybe a little bit about that genealogical exploration. Where's the other side of your family from? Maybe a little bit about your Polish connection.
All right, just before we start that, just to make you even more jealous of Melbourne, we've now had 47 consecutive days of 0 COVID cases. So
wow.
All our restrictions are almost completely lifted. No masks required, schools, community events, all those sorts of things. Everything's open, back to normal, almost completely back to normal. So that's pretty lucky.
And how did you?
So of course, our thoughts are with Poland and everybody else in America.
Yeah.
So as you said before, the only way COVID came in, because we're an island, well, we imported it from Australians returning from overseas. So pretty much they shut the borders and they made everybody who flies into Australia and returns has to do 2 weeks quarantine in a hotel, or like a quarantine hotel, before they get released back into the community, so to speak.
Yeah, and your quarantine, because I was following a friend of mine who you might know, Irene Pletka. Do you know Irene?
No.
She's very much. She's actually interesting. She was born in Shanghai, and then family went to Australia, grew up in Melbourne, and came back, and then now lives in New York, but travels around a lot. And she was just sort of sending photos every day on posting on Facebook about her quarantine. So in the rest of the world, in places that I've seen, it's quarantine. They kind of say, "Oh, be at home, and we might check on you." Australia is a serious quarantine. You're in a hotel, their hotel, the government or contracted hotel. They're keeping an eye on you. It's their food. I mean, it's really real deal quarantine.
You can't leave. Your quarantine hotel, and there's police guarding you. You're not allowed to get out. So they give you your food, they give you everything. It's a nice hotel you can stay at, Ridges, Sheraton, all those sorts of things. But yeah, you're stuck in your room for 2 weeks to make sure you don't spread or leak to other parts of the community.
But you see the result is that the rest of the
world. And it works, yeah.
It works. Yeah. The rest, we're all struggling with it, and cases we don't even know how many because there's very little testing, and America is just a nightmare. And you see that they're doing something. So good for you, Australia. I mean, one more reason to love and love/resent you, lucky guys in Australia.
Exactly.
So tell us about your family connection to Poland, Ezra. We'll start with that.
Yeah, so my father was actually born in Krakow, Poland, after the war, in 1948. And then he came to Australia in 1950, but his parents were both born in Krakow, and going back generations, interesting, they never really spoke to my dad much about their family history or about their time in Poland. And I never got through to them in that regard either. What they did do, when I was actually in Poland, I actually 2 years ago went to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and I sat down with one of the genealogists there, and I always knew that we had a long history in Krakow. But I don't even think my father knew his grandparents' name, because he wasn't anything really. The archives all the way back to the 1730s, which is, I think, roughly about as far as you can go in Poland
1730 is definitely pretty far back. You skipped out a little bit there, but I think we understood. Ezra,
and that's where that's where it stands. So it's quite 200 and yeah.
How did they survive? How did they survive the war? Your father's parents.
So they survived the war. They went to the Russian side as soon as Krakow was invaded. They went like the not unknown story, not unfamiliar story. They went to Uzbekistan, Tashkent. They were there, and then after the war, they came back.
Came back and then had your father. And then how did their process? What did that look like leaving to go to Australia? Did they have choices? Did they just get sent there like the convicts? What did that look like?
So when they say they went back, they didn't quite go back to where they came from. They didn't go back to the original house. They went back to, like most of these people came back, they were put up in other smaller apartments, of course. So they always had that in mind. But after the war, they spent 6 months in Paris in like 49. They pretty much left Poland straight away. They were in Paris in the Platz, they call the Pretzel, the Jewish area.
Yeah.
And then they made their way to Australia. I don't think they certainly weren't sent by convicts, but my grandmother had a cousin who was in Australia who just got there a bit earlier.
So the family.
So if you had a relation, you could also, it was a lot easier to get a visa. Yeah.
Right, family connection. That makes sense. And what about your mother's side of the family?
So my mother's father's from Germany, and he escaped the war because his family left Germany in 1938 after Kristallnacht, before the war. So they went to London, and his journey to Australia is infamous or famous, depending on your perspective. There was a ship that was sent from England to Australia carrying Jewish refugees. I'm not sure how familiar this story is to an American audience or Polish audience, but it's quite famous in Australia.
Americans assume that none of us know anything about anything. That's the safe assumption, Ezra.
Yeah, and it's usually true.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was called the Dunera, and so when England thought they were going to be invaded by the Germans after they'd taken over France, after France had fallen, they put together any German-born nationals from the ages of, I think it was 16 to 35 or something like that, who potentially could have been a spy, were rounded up and sent to Australia. So when you said my grandfather on my parents' side by convicts, it's actually on my mother's side. So they were sent to Australia, and they were mistreated on the ship. Again, comparing it to whatever other experiences people had in the war, absolutely nothing, but it was an overcrowded ship, and actually had German POWs on there. They had some Italian fascists, they had some German Nazi sympathizers with them. They were all put together, and there was majority of Jews, and they came to Australia. So he came to Australia in 1940, 41, around then, and my grandmother, from my mother's side, is quite rare that she was actually born in Australia. And her parents came to Australia after World War One. So the previous war, their generation earlier, they came from Israel.
So that's very long. Yeah, as you say, a country, especially from the Jewish point of view, that's serious yichus of being already.
It's over 100 years in Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long time. But I'm interested about the ship because, first of all, as an ignorant American, I'm not familiar with the story. But I'm interested. There's something. It seems strange to me that Jews who were being clearly persecuted for years and years in Germany, leading up to the war, would be treated as just any other German. Sure, we'll take these Germans and the Jews and throw them all in a boat and do what we usually have done since the 17th century and send them to Australia.
So they also didn't know where they were going on the boat. They actually thought they may have gone to Canada. They may have thought they were going anywhere that England had sort of part of the Commonwealth, a relationship to. Yeah. So it is interesting. There was an official apology given by Churchill, in 43, I think it was. But it was pretty much a sledgehammer approach to England. Were panicking at the time that they think the Germans had just invaded continental Europe and they were coming across for the Battle of Britain. They were scared that anybody potentially could have been a German spy. Again, to think that the Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany would help the German war machine against Britain is a bit far-fetched, but unfortunately that's what happened at the time, or fortunately, depending how you look at it. Yeah. And that's how we ended up in Australia. A lot of them stayed in Australia. Quite a few famous people actually came on that ship. A few went back to England and to other parts, but they made quite a serious contribution to Australia. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think, it's not anything revolutionary to say that war brings out, very often the extreme nature of war brings out the best and brings out the worst in people, but also in societies. And I think, we can look, you don't have to look much farther as an American to the way that we locked up Japanese in internment camps, concentration camps, really during World War II. And even moving past that, I think it's interesting, very interesting. It's tragic, really, that very often you have groups that leave a country, that are persecuted in a country, and then come to the new country, and then they're associated with the group that was persecuting them. So you had, after you had in the United States years ago, Iranians that had fled, the revolution, the Islamic revolution, and the Ayatollah. And then we're being called Ayatollah and stuff by Americans who just didn't understand. So I guess it's just the way that history, that first generation always seems to have it rough in that sense.
But in Australia, the treatment was totally different than the English. So in Australia, they weren't mistreated at all, and they were pretty much, they were housed in camps as such, and not, again, I use the word camps because they were camps, but certainly not in the camps in the German Nazi sense of the word camps. Right. And they were given kosher food, and they had universities and lectures and all these sorts of things, but they were, restrained. But then pretty much like a year later, I think that most of them were released. All of them, some went to the army, a lot joined the Australian army to fight against the Germans. So it was a quick turnaround. In England, they were regarded as potential German spies. Once they get to Australia, they could already be shipped off to the army to fight, more likely the Japanese, but they could still be fighting the Germans as well, depending where they were sent, what was happening.
Younger countries usually don't stand on principles so much. Like in Israel, you landed, you had one sandwich, and they gave you a gun. You went to fight in the War of Independence, or pre-war. So growing up, I'm curious. I want to hear a little bit about your first memory of coming to Poland, and before you came to Poland, what was Poland? How was Poland seen in your family? As talked about. And also Germany.
So my grandfather really didn't speak about Germany much at all. He did mention his parents and growing up in their household and what would happen and stuff like that. But also because his immediate family all went to England, they actually survived. So he had cousins and uncles who were lost in the war, but his brothers, actually another brother was on the same ship as him into Australia. So there's that branch of the family, and there's other siblings in England. So they sort of never discussed really Germany per se. But on the Polish side, so my grandparents spoke Polish to each other. They spoke Polish to my father. So I picked up very rudimentary, basic Polish. They spoke English to me, but they said Polish to each other. And one of the interesting things is, because Melbourne is such a particularly strong Polish community, it wasn't strange to be Polish at all. In fact, that was generally the default position to have Polish grandparents and to have either Holocaust survivors, literally from the camps, survivors, or those who were hidden, or those who, like my grandparents, got sent to Russia or survived in the Soviet Russia system. So that was just part and parcel of everybody's life. So it wasn't like unique. Oh, you're from Polish background. It's almost everybody was from Polish background. And in fact, so much so that growing up, we actually didn't refer to ourselves as Polish. I actually always referred to myself as coming from Krakow. And if it was anybody, another family from Krakow, that's how regional it was. It was like, Congress Poland and Galicia. Warsaw was totally different. And even there was people from Czestochowa and each little towns, Białystok, all these sorts of stuff. That's where you came from. It wasn't Poland. That's how specific we really were.
I think that when I was visiting Australia, or before I was visiting, I guess I heard that, that Melbourne is Polish and Sydney is Hungarian.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you just a little story. When I went to Melbourne, it was exactly as you're describing. Everywhere I went, everyone was Polish, and Krakow and Łódź and here, and everybody was Polish, really. And I met with so many people. It was fantastic. And I said, oh, it feels so great. I was speaking Polish with all the older people and some people even younger who were heard from their parents and picked it up like you a little bit, and wonderful. And I said, oh, it feels so good. I just came from Krakow and feels like I'm right at home here, in Melbourne. I love Melbourne, speaking Polish. And then I went and I did a few talks in Sydney, and I said, listen, I got to tell you, my family, I'm living in Poland. I'm a Polish citizen, but my family and my father's family is Hungarian. And don't say anything to anybody in Melbourne, but of course it takes a Hungarian to go to Poland and go to Krakow and to do what I'm doing and rebuilding Jewish life. So I was kind of playing both sides of the fence.
Both sides. Yeah. So that divide is real.
So,
that Hungarian divide in the kosher food, like in the restaurants, there's much more Polish style. Again, nowadays, a lot of it's Israeli, both in Sydney and in Melbourne. But growing up, and certainly after the war, the Polish influence was very strong in Melbourne, and the Hungarian influence was very strong in Sydney. And there's a real clear divide in the way the communities operated, the way the different shuls and synagogues, again, different styles, all those sorts of things was very, very different.
And I understand when I was there, and it was, it's well underway, and it has been for years, that there's a strong influx of South Africans who are generally almost exclusively Litvaks, right? Right. So now, and they are, you have some in Melbourne, but a little bit, probably more, maybe it's changed, but I think in the beginning, more of them to Sydney than to Melbourne. And I understand that really affected a change in the community, that the South Africans are sort of very communally involved and sort of a different, maybe Australians a little bit more laid back, South Africans a little more kind of intense, active in the community sense. So has that affected the community structures that you have these?
Yeah, it has, definitely. Perth, which is like the third city, is particularly very South African dominated. So if you go to the Perth Jewish school, the joke is you'll come out with an Australian South African accent just because of all the South Africans there. So in Melbourne, the South Africans certainly have been a big influence. They come, and also they operate, they're all professionals, so they get good jobs as accountants, lawyers, or computer industries now, whatever it may be. To the extent, though, they have quite a strong communal influence as well. They also set up their own shuls, their Litvish style or their particular South African style. Choirs have been introduced more because they're big into their choirs, which Australian shuls traditionally didn't have, because they're more the Polish shtibel style, where you don't have the South Africans like their choirs and like their chazonas, so they have that sort of stuff. So you can definitely feel their influence, and there's thousands of them here as well.
Interesting. And I understood like a lot of the teachers in the schools are South African. That was my experience when I visited the schools. So we're talking about, do you remember your first visit to Poland?
There's only been 2 of them, so I do.
Only
my
twice?
first one was actually 2005.
I feel like I'm so surprised to hear that, because I feel like I've seen you 10 times in Poland. You've only been here twice? I'm shocked.
Yeah, but I make an impact when I come.
You make quite an impact. I walk down the street these days, I feel like I see you all the time. So when was the first time, Ezra?
That was 2005. I went with my father to Poland. That was the first time. To say he'd been back, but he actually hadn't been back since 1948. He left a 6-month-old child, so he had no first-hand memories of Poland. But he did have memories from his parents, what his parents had told him. Like even as a kid, walking around the planta, the garden in the main Polish area. So all that sort of stuff he knew, but he actually couldn't remember himself being there, but he knew of these places. So that was the first time I was there. We were there just for a week, and in fact, so much so, we only flew him straight to Jonathana Airport in Krakow, and we stayed there for 4 days, and then we drove to Prague. We didn't see anything else. We did one day, we did a tour of like east and then south of Poland, like went through Tarnów and then all the way to Rymanów and Dukla, and then back like by Novi Sącz to Zakopane. Actually went to Zakopane because that's where my grandparents used to go for holidays. So we did like the long trip to Zakopane. We drove back to Krakow, and then we drove off to Prague. So really, as I said before, when you say Poland in Melbourne, you've got to be more specific than that where you come from. It's really regionally strongly based. So that's the first trip I had, and yeah, I thought it was excellent. I really enjoyed the trip.
Was it
seeing those
emotional?
places.
Was it emotional?
Subsequently to that,
Oh, I still want to ask about the first trip. Was it emotional being there with your father? What was that? He hadn't been. I mean, he didn't remember because he was a small child, a baby really when he left. But just from he speaking, having this strong Polish background, hearing Polish, at home, growing up. What was it like for him? And then what was it like for you because of how he was affected?
I think it would have been a lot more emotional if people go on those trips with their grandparents who actually were there at the time and actually point and say, that house over there, that room over there, that was me, that was, that I think is a lot more emotional. It was emotional in the sense that a lot of the places you'd heard of you actually see in real life. But it was interesting also as an eye-opener because you hear these stories and they become mythologized in some way, not necessarily wonderful, fantastic, the best ever, or that they're terrible. It's just it's in your mind what you picture it to be, and you've got nothing to base it on. So going there and seeing it for the first time, that actually was the hospital he was born in. That was the apartment block that his grandparents or his parents actually used to own, and that's where they used to live. Puts some substance to it. Not that you disbelieve these stories, but you actually once you visualize it yourself, you're like, oh, okay, walking down Krakowska Street or Ditla, just picking out, okay, number 10 Ditla, yep, that's where my uncle used to live, that's where this used to happen, that's the shul they used to daven at. So you can actually make, it firms it up. So I was emotional in that sense, I think, as opposed to actually triggering any memories or anything like that, because there were none, certainly from me and not from him either.
Yeah. And what about the subsequent trip?
That was 2017 now. So that was a fantastic trip, and that was 3 weeks in Poland. And I'd done, in between my two trips, I've done a lot more research about the family history, and also Poland itself has developed a lot more in what it caters for Jewish life as well, caters a lot more. No thanks to you. So that was really interesting. It was a full-on trip, so every day was jam-packed. I spent basically dividing it up almost a week in Łódź, a week in Warsaw, and a week in Krakow, and I had like in 2 sections of Krakow. So I came back for 3 days when the cultural festival was on, which was a wonderful experience. Then I had also a week earlier, I had like 3 days just to see it for myself and the places that I wanted to see. So yeah, that was a fantastic trip for me. Again, busy all day, every day, so much to see, all the different places, loved it. It also put, again, in my mind, a lot of dots together that I had, questions I had in my own mind over the subsequent years had thought about, just actually seeing the way things all fit together. I put a lot of things together on that trip over there, which I did appreciate. Met a lot of good people as well, made some contacts, so that was always nice, and connection.
What was your week in Łódź like? I lived in Łódź when I first came to Poland, so I feel a certain strange love-hate with a little bit less love, a little bit more hate toward poor Łódź. So, Łódź gets a bad rap in Poland.
It gets a bad rap. When I told people, in Warsaw or Krakow, I'd been to Łódź early, they looked at me like I was a nutcase, like, what do you go there for? So it was interesting. I've got no personal connection to Łódź at all. It's just like other people I know, families, their parents and their grandparents come from Łódź, so I didn't have any emotional reason to go there myself. And I think I got there on a Thursday and I left on a Tuesday, so it was almost a week. I actually stayed in the Jewish Center, Pomorska 18, I think it is. Is that where they have their Jewish, everything's all pretty centralized. Right. It's easy to walk around. It's all very so concentrated and so local. What surprised me the most about it was how young the city is. Yeah. It really only started like 100 years ago. It's really not much more than that.
19th century, late 19th century, or mid.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
late 19th century. A real boom town, and then boom and bust.
Correct. Yeah. So I did enjoy what I saw there, and again, because I stayed in the Jewish community there, you get to see the same people a couple of times a day. They were very friendly. They were very warm. Rabbi David, I'm not going to pronounce his last name. But that's the one. He was very friendly, very nice. There was a couple of David Garfinkel.
Because he's from Krakow. Because he's from Krakow.
Yes.
David, yeah.
And in fact, actually, the weekend I was there, the Shabbos that I was there was quite a few young people from Warsaw who had actually just gone to Łódź for a weekend away. So I caught up with them. So I met them, wasn't caught up with them, and hung out with them and went out with them. So that was, So I got the tour. So again, there's a lot to see there without focusing on it. There's the ghetto, the Holocaust, there's the Radika station. So there's enough to fill in your time. And also the main street that they've redeveloped, and the Poznacie Museum and the manufacturer area. That's all fantastic.
They've done a lot with the city. It's just, in some ways, it suffers from being very close to Warsaw. So it's sort of almost close enough. I think that the future of Łódź will be if they're talking for years and years and years about building a fast train. And if they wind up building the fast train, then you can even have, because you have all this beautiful old housing stock, these old factories that have been turned into lofts and this thing. And real estate in Warsaw is very expensive relatively in Poland, and more than other places. So if they kind of do a good job of connecting Łódź to Warsaw, then you can have people that are commuting, and it will really change, I think, help the city a lot and change the nature. So let's talk a little bit about ASPJ. First of all, you're the president. Congratulations. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
How long have you been the president for?
So I've been co-president for a couple of years now, but my other co-president retired, one of a COVID victim, not a victim in the sense of anything happening to him, but he just reassessed during COVID because we had a lockdown period. So when he reassessed, so he decided that he was going to step back. But he was the founder, the single most responsible person for going forward. He was a fantastic person for many, many years, Mr. Bernard Corbin. So he pulled back. So you'll be familiar with Bernard.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
So that left me last man standing.
Tell us about ASPJ.
So the ASPJ is actually, I think it's quite a unique organisation in the sense that it is as the name says, the Australian Society of Polish Jews and their descendants. And as you spoke about in the introduction, our aim is to further the communications between the Polish and Jewish communities. So we've got three arms, basically what we focus on. We do events with people of interest from Poland. So, for example, somebody like you, or we've had guests coming in. We had Rabbi Shudrick, because we did an event with him, but we've also bring our guests to Australia. We've got Darius Popilias on our list to come. He was meant to come this year, but that all got cancelled because of COVID. We've also had Pavel Bramson, which you may be familiar with. He's the ex-skinhead who became a cop. Yeah, so he came. So he was quite a celebrity when he came. Got a cool story and a cool video about him. We do all sorts of lectures on, again, so we try not to focus on the Holocaust exclusively. We don't avoid the Holocaust, of course, but that's not, there's a Holocaust Centre here and a Holocaust Museum. So we don't look at that. We look at Polish Jewish life before the war or cultural Polish life now as well. So we try to do events for that, and that often engages different people and causes conversations to be had for people, and people get engaged in those sorts of things. That's one aspect of what we do. The second aspect is actually to liaise with the Polish Community Council of Victoria and the Polish community, and we've got really warm relations. We've got warm relations with the head of the Catholic Church, the Polish Catholic Church. We've got the president of the PCCV, the Polish Community Council of Victoria, or those with the diplomatic corps, the Polish consul and the Polish embassy, the ambassador, all these sort of guys. And that's important in the sense, if there are issues with the Polish government, to put it mildly, there's some areas of concern. We do have a window or an opportunity to discuss it with them. And let's just say sometimes the Polish community here, a guest comes from Radio Maria or somebody like that, on quite the right wing. And if there's, or an article's published in one of the Polish newspapers that could be offensive to people. So again, it's not always confrontation with them. We've got strong supporters and they really support what we do and they encourage us and we work well together. We're not duplicates of each other, absolutely, because we focus on the Jewish aspect and they focus on their wider Polish cultural aspect. But there are common areas. In the Venn diagram, there's quite a big area that's overlapping. So we do functions together. That's the second thing we do. And the third thing we do is actually with government as well. So the Australian government and also the Polish government, when they have Polish members of the SEM come to Australia for a visit, they will go out of their way to have an audience with the ASPJ. Duda came to Australia a couple of years ago. There wasn't time for a specific function, but we were invited to those functions where he was, turning up, because he was only in Melbourne for a day, a quick trip. So those sorts of things. And the Australian ambassador to Poland now, before he went on his trip to Poland or his job posting to Poland, he actually had a meeting with us just to discuss Jewish-Polish relations, which again, considering the size of the Jewish population in Poland, is very considerate of him to go out of his way to put that as one of his primary concerns, and also considering that Polish-Jewish relations is not the #1 issue in Australian society, it's also very good of him to have that concern. So that's our 3 major areas. So we call ourselves like to preserve, promote, and educate. Preserve the historical legacy of Polish culture, so it's not only Holocaust. And there's a lot of people who don't want anything to do. I'm sure you come across this all the time. They say Poland's finished, that's it. There's nothing there. But of course, based on Poland Museum, there's aspects you can say there's a full 1,000-year history beforehand. So we preserve, we promote current day Polish Jewish relations and what happens with you in Polish Jewish community. JCC Krakow is a perfect example of that. And we also educate to try to explain to people again, which you get that view, which again wouldn't be unfamiliar to you, that every Pole's an anti-Semite, Poland just it's one big graveyard, all these sorts of things. So we're not apologists for what happened, of course, but again, we just try to educate the facts.
Absolutely. So maybe just a question about numbers for a second, and maybe I should have maybe asked a little earlier about this. How many Jews in Australia?
Yeah. So at the moment, they reckon about 120,000 in Australia, and it's probably a little bit more than that. That's the official number, and it would be roughly 40% Melbourne, and then the rest in Perth or Brisbane or other places.
And how many of those are Polish descent?
It's hard to tell because there's pure Polish descendants, like both grandparents are Poles, and you've got one Polish grandparent. So that's, again, how you define it, but a lot. I think what happened, so as you know, after World War II, there was about 35,000 Jewish refugees came to Australia, of which 18,000, roughly half came to Melbourne and half came to Sydney. And of that 18,000, the vast majority were Polish. And that really doubled the size of the Melbourne Jewish community. So if you just work it out from there, there's a whole lot more that have sprung from the descendants of those. So they've got Polish roots, quite a healthy percentage.
And what about Poles, non-Jewish Poles or Australians of Polish descent that aren't Jewish?
So a few came after 1968 to Australia, and then a few came also in after 1990 and the 2000s. There was another big push, and Melbourne again is the biggest city for Polish Jews in Australia. Again, how you defined it is that if one of your parents are Pole, the other one's Greek, or the other one's Australian or Japanese, whatever it is. But they are a significant community, but they're not one of the biggest ones going around, like the English diaspora, the American, New Zealand,
Greek,
Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese. They're a lot bit Greek, absolutely. Yeah, Greek's massive. Yeah.
Greek is massive.
Yeah.
And what about how many members do you have in the ASPJ? So
we don't really run it in the membership base. We try to. There is a membership option for people to have.
Do you have membership? I should have asked.
Yeah, exactly, correct. So we don't push it per se.
Yeah.
There is a membership there, but we get a couple of hundred people turning up to functions like online webinar. We had one last week where we had like 200 on the night, and the views are now over 500 views. So we get. I think we get quite a substantial push and reach out there. Yeah.
And is there because sometimes organizations like this, and it's not limited to Jewish organizations, but very often when you're talking about Jewish diasporic organizations like yours, in whether it's in Australia or in Israel or in this, there can be sometimes a focus, or I should say, is there any reticence? Are people a little bit reluctant to focus on the contemporary community and not see it as real or as important, and really only want to focus on the past? Do you get that from within your, not membership, but within your constituency there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the big criticisms is, so, it's a complex issue, and Melbourne is a very strong Zionistic community.
Yeah. Very strong.
Australia's got one of the highest Aliyah rates, and thankfully everyone who makes Aliyah from Australia is generally going by choice, not because they're being pushed. So they don't have to run away and escape. They're going because they want to do it. So it's a very strong Zionistic community. We do get criticism that don't focus on Poland. Poland was the past. Israel is the future. Just put a line straight through it. There shouldn't be a reason why Jews are living in Poland anymore. I'm sure you come across this criticism as well. Why do you promote it? There's there's no point being there. So we do get that from elements of the Jewish community. We also get, of course, the other side of that, which is also they're all anti-Semites, don't believe a word of it. It could happen again. I mean, again, nothing that's unfamiliar to anybody who's involved in Polish-Jewish relations anywhere in the world.
Of course.
My grandmother told me, my mother told me, so therefore,
Right. No question. And are young people that are the next generation, your generation, so people whose parents maybe were born or even grandparents from Poland, is there interest among, people your age and younger, or is it really just one of those things that it's kind of you're odd because you're actually interested, and then most people are sort of like, it's already from the past?
So it's interesting. I would say that my parents' generation, a lot more of them actually spoke Polish because of their parents. Right. Whereas my generation, very few speak Polish now. I mean, again, my Polish I've gone out of my way to try learn. It's still pretty basic. Mówię dobrze po polsku, zawsze po polsku.
Your pronunciation is very good.
Sort of.
Says the
but I'm a natural. But because at school, everybody does, like a Holocaust roots or a family roots project now. So you investigate Poland because you discuss where your grandparents come from. So the previous generation never did that. It was just a given. You came from Poland, but you're starting a new life in Australia and focus on the new life going forward. Don't look back, look forward, which is, as you said, the first generation general direction. Just look forward looking, don't look backwards. Whereas this generation, we don't have the emotional baggage, and it's dismissive to say, but a lot of what did happen is history because we can't actually feel what happened because it happened 50, 60 years before we were born. So it doesn't really relate to us as much. So therefore, we're interested in that aspect of it. So I think the young generation have a more open-minded approach about it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Australian kids go for the gap year, like between school and university. They go to Israel, and part of the Israel programs, they go to Poland for a week. Right. March of the Living is quite strong in Australia, and again, there are criticism of this project, and some people don't like them because they only focus on the death camps and they make Poland black and Israel white and Poland death.
I'll tell you that I'm dealing with the Australian March of the Living for years. The first group from across the whole world, and now everybody comes to the JCC and we meet with them and they learn about the Jewish, what's happening with the community. The first group ever that really connected to us and came was the Australian March of the Living. And I know last few years, it's kind of gone a little bit downhill just because of what you're saying, that all the students, everybody has that gap year trip to Israel and they stop in Poland, and people don't want to come, for a high school student to come twice to Poland from Australia where it's so far doesn't really make sense. So I think the Australian March of the Living has become less of a thing as there are other opportunities to come to Poland. But the Australian March did a better job than just about anybody.
They also went to the war school, Warszawa school, Lauder school, the first March of the Living school, to show an actual living Polish community, which is a big step for a lot of these guys. A lot of reluctance, a lot of resistance from Israel. The organizers didn't want any of that.
Yeah.
But they actually went ahead and did it. So full credit to them for doing that.
No question about it. So a few more questions, Aviv. One, Aviv is my question about Aviv. Not to call you Aviv. So have you had babka from Aviv?
Personally, I haven't, but there's a reason why, though. It's not strictly kosher, but there are other bakeries that you can have babka from.
It used to be more, right? It used to be more kosher, and then it changed ownership or something. Is that the thing?
Sort of like that. Yeah, exactly. But there are quite a few bakeries you can get your babkas from. I
have to say that, and I'm a big fan. A few things that I like, and I talk about them ad nauseum: pizza and ice cream and this. I'm a big fan of babka. There's a few places in the world. I think the best that I've had in the entire world was from Aviv's. And I brought 2 babkas back on the plane with me. I wrapped them up. And when I told them, I thought it was so unique. Oh, I'm flying back to Europe with the babkas. And they were like, yeah, of course you are. Like, why wouldn't you? And it was no big deal, but phenomenal. I hope they get their kashrut back up to Ezra May standards, because you really need to try it.
I'll look forward to that day.
Yeah. And it might not be a very fair question or a timely question to ask, but are you team Latke or team Hamantash, as I ask you on the last day of Hanukkah?
I was going to say, judging by recent what I've eaten, I'd have to say Latke goes yeah, I think because it's warm generally, I think I'd go for a latke over a Hamantash. Yeah, and also some of the latkes you get nowadays are just out of control. They're so fancy. They've got like triple layers and marshmallows and meringues and all sorts of fancy toppings on top. Whereas Hamantash still seem to be at least a little bit more basic. So I'm easily seduced by the fancy creams.
You go for the bells and whistles.
Exactly.
And a very important question that I always ask, which is, what are your 3 favorite films?
Good question. So one of them, which on the spot you're putting me here now, I should have prepared myself. One I actually do like, which is going to put me in a dark place, Son of Saul.
Son of Saul. Yeah, that's a light-hearted film.
I was going to say for casual entertainment,
yeah.
Only because I actually knew a Sonda Commando, or an ex-Sonda Commando from Treblinka, one of the only ones in the world, and quite a remarkable personality. He actually testified at a few trials. He did all sorts. He made a model of Treblinka. He's excellent. So although this wasn't set in Treblinka, just to get some idea of what it actually looked like, what he was doing in that experience, I found it quite a impactful, quite an emotional movie. So I'll put Son of Saul in there. Another favorite movie, I got to go Dumb and Dumber. I can watch it 1,000 times in a row and I'll laugh every time.
I love it too.
I know that says more about, not necessarily together the same genre as Son of Saul, but
Son of Saul and Dumb and Dumber. I almost feel like I should not allow you to even give a third, just because you've picked the 2 movies most diametrically opposed on the planet.
Exactly.
But let me ask you, what's your favorite scene from Dumb and Dumber? Because I have mine, a very specific moment in Dumb and Dumber that I love.
You tell me I'm still a chance.
I like when he's having the snowball fight, and she's all joking around and this, and she throws a snowball joking, and he gets hit, and you just see it in his eyes, and you get how he's just like all bets are off, and he just creams her with the snowball. It's a classic.
But when he's having that argument at the end or discussing, and she's saying, even if you're the last person on earth and there's nobody else, blah blah blah, and he goes, so I'm still a chance.
Right, we need oil boys. Yeah, it's great. It's a very funny movie. And maybe a third. I'm dying to see where you're going. Dumb and Dumber, Son of Saul, and
I'll tell you what, I'll give you one you've never ever heard of. So you can look it up on YouTube. It's called The Club, and it's about my Australian Rules football club and about the dynamics of a football club, new players coming in and coaches and everything like that. But the reason it's in my top 3 movies is because at the end, our club wins the premiership.
Essendon?
So if you don't win it in real life, Collingwood. Collingwood is called. Black and white stripes.
Okay. Did Pierre Domenico play for them?
Australian rules football, not soccer. It's a whole nother topic.
Pierre Domenico is Australian rules, no?
No. Oh, Dipper Domenico. Sorry. Robert Dippy Domenico. Gotcha. Robert,
yeah.
He's a Hawthorn player. Yeah, that's right. No, he's another team. But you're right. It was a good get though, the name. Dippy Domenico.
I tried. Ezra, thank you so much for taking the time. I look forward to your next visit to Krakow. I look forward to staying in touch with you. But you're coming, and my understanding is that you are going to pledge here on live Almost TV that you will come and do Ride for the Living.
Almost pledging.
Very good. We'll take the almost pledge.
I certainly support it.
Thank you.
You too.
Ezra, be well.
Good luck and stay safe.
Friends.
And regards to everybody, the JCC, all my friends there, and Rabbi Boimel. I look forward to him being able to return to Krakow. And best of luck to you and to everybody. And hopefully COVID resolves itself and all the other issues Poland's going through. May they come to a safe resolution for everybody. You're in our thoughts always.
Inshallah. Be well, Ezra. Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Do widzenia and good night.
Do widzenia and good night. And good morning. Get some sleep.